Hello and welcome to the Online Educators Forum. I'm your host, Reverend Dr. Lindsay Andrioli-Comstock, and today we're talking about the future of lifelong learning. And here to help us understand more about the growing importance of this community of educators, I am joined by Josh Lunde-Whitler, a fellow board member and the president of the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry. Josh, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Josh, tell our viewers, what is the term lifelong learning intending to mean? What does lifelong learning really mean?
Well, I think that change in language, for our organization, it happened in 2013. Before that, we were known as the Society for the Advancement of Continuing Educators in Ministry. And I think that transition from continuing education to lifelong learning was part of it. The idea that learning is something that happens over the course of your entire life and not just from one program or a certificate or whatever it might be. I think also in the case of our organization, we were looking at, and I'm speaking like I wasn't there at the time, I'll be honest. This was, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. There was this desire to make sure that it was known that what ALLLM was doing was not just for those going into professional ministry, but for those who were in other fields as well that could be considered ministry in some way, which was always a part of the focus of the organization. It had been around for quite a while, but just to make a finer point on that, I think.
I like that.
Also, I like to joke that ALLLM was trying to win a contest of how many L's it could fit into a 5-letter acronym in its name. So we came up with ALLLM, just to be complicated.
And I think that we win the award of the longest name, even though we've changed our name, we've found a way to keep it the longest name.
That's
and it
right.
makes it quite difficult to create logos of any kind.
As you would know, since you helped us create the new one. So, but everybody knows that concision, that's out. It's all about being as long as possible now.
I love it. Well, I think you shared an important distinction with the term lifelong learning, because I see it more and more nowadays. Whereas I think a lot of our viewers maybe are familiar with the language of like continuing education or con ed. But I think there is a difference, even though they're quite similar. I think there is a difference. It's more of this robust idea of we're always learners that you were talking about, and then nuancing the ways in which this organization, our organization, also expands that outside of theological education. So I think that's an important nuance. Thank you for that. So ALLLM has been around for a long time. Josh, tell our viewers, what is ALLLM and how did you become involved in it?
Well, as I mentioned, it has had about a 55-year history at this point, and it was originally SOCM. And, it's had a lot of ebbs and flows over the course of several decades, especially in the aughts, from what I understand, was really when it began to, feel the differences that were already happening in theological education, how it was responding to that. And as much as the organization was trying to be more than just for seminary programs, that's still kind of how it was understood. That's still kind of the framework of a lot of these programs, a con ed program in the way that that's normally thought of. And I think that there was a push to change that, but there was also a sense that this model isn't working in the same way that it used to. And I think that that's where a lot of changes are happening, especially since the pandemic has hit. There's been this influx of new energy around continuing education and for lifelong learning and leadership in particular, because of a couple of different reasons. One is the Association of Theological Schools changing updating their standards. Now schools are now being evaluated based on lifelong learning specifically, and it uses that language as a part of their own accreditation process now. But beyond that, there's other programs and other institutions that are trying to fill in the gaps now as seminaries are closing. This is happening throughout higher education in general. organizations that are trying to fill in the gaps there of what's missing. And as they're doing so, they're coming up with new ideas, incubating new programs, innovating new ideas. And there's some grant money coming in a variety of ways that's helping that along. So I think that's part of it. And I think that's part of how I got involved with the organization. ALLLM was associated, it's considered a related learning organization with the Religious Education Association. And my background is as a minister and a religious educator. So I was already a part of the REA, connected with ALLLM through Helen Blyer, who's a mutual colleague over at Pittsburgh Seminary. And she introduced me to ALLLM. And pretty soon, before I knew it, I was on the board. I was like, all right. Sarah Erickson, who's still is the director over at Columbia Seminary. She has been in the leadership role for many years, but has recently stepped down, and I was invited to step in her place. So I think part of it for me was a real interest in these innovative approaches, these ideas of, trying to, ministry is a field, like many fields, we're trying to change and innovate along with what's happening in society. And seminaries have not always been as responsive to those changes. The ones that are doing better than others. The ones that are going more online, the ones that are focusing on online learning and doing online only programs, I feel like are weathering the storms of change better than others. And I was particularly interested in creating spaces for ministers to be more innovative themselves and for programs to reflect that as well. And so actually teaching innovation in a way, teaching ministers and giving them the tools to actually come up with new ways of thinking. And we've led some seminars recently on design thinking and those kinds of adaptive approaches to leadership and those kinds of things. Those are all kind of the same lines there. So I came into it with that interest, and I was the director of a nonprofit that was doing some of this stuff, and I'm still kind of developing some incubatory space from now and even as I continue in ministry and religious education. So that's kind of my interests, but also where I see the organization going is more in that direction. And I see a lot of progress happening throughout the field in that regard.
Yeah. It's fascinating to me, Josh, that 55 years ago, somebody said, paradigms are shifting. We need to find a way to look at an MDiv or even a BA and say, this is not the end. 55 years ago, and all the life iterations that SOCM and ALLLM have had, all being responses to continual shifting paradigms where lifelong learning, continuing education, all of these things are responding rather than reacting to what's happening in the world and trying to prepare people to educate in ways that are inclusive and justice-filled and encompassing, so that people understand the changing times. It's fascinating to me this happened 55 years ago, and yet these iterations represent that throughout ALLLM's history.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to jump in there, but just to say, in the 60s was kind of a cultural shifting point too, right? Like there was some stuff going on in the country and in the world in the 60s, and stuff's going on now. Not the least of which the pandemic, but also interests in social justice and interests in what's happening politically and environmentally. All these things. We're on high alert right now, and there's I don't know I'm kind of maybe making a spurious correlation there, but I do find it interesting that in the wake of the pandemic, and your interview with Erica pointed to this, was the the ones who were doing continuing education were among the more responsive and adaptive people.
Right.
And seminaries were reaching out to their colleagues in lifelong learning and saying, how do we do stuff? Because they were the ones who were able to kind of adapt to the changing times and situations. And so I find that interesting, and maybe part of this as well, that as you're getting there with comfort with these online tools and comfort with working maybe a little bit outside of the strictures of the institution itself,
Right.
grow a more adaptive mindset or an innovative mindset. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, and I think just perhaps it's in the DNA of continuing education that to offer continuing education, you have to be able to understand what new variables the minister or the leader or the trainer or the executive director is dealing with. So there's already this kind of back and forth between the educator and the individual receiving the education. And so as a result, it's in the DNA to be adaptive, to be innovative, to think outside the box, to have this design thinking mentality. So it is fascinating. You're right that Erica responded very much saying, yeah, we became the hub to get us through for her particular institution. And I think a lot of people have found that to be the case. And how is that represented among members of ALLLM? How is the diversity of ways in which we educate nowadays? What does that look like as far as ALLLM membership, ALLLM participation?
Well, there's been a lot of conversation among us, at least, about the landscape of what lifelong learning in ministry looks like. Again, the seminary is kind of considered to be the hub, and where we tend to think of these programs, and Doctor of Ministry programs being among, they're the degree bearing program, but you also have certificate programs of various sorts. The denominations as well, especially in the Protestant tradition, are also part of that as well. And, Catholic schools, I'm thinking specifically of Boston College, has a very rigorous continuing education program that they use that is beneficial to a lot of people, a lot of lay ministers in the Catholic Church. But in the Protestant churches, there's a lot of these certificate programs or just you do it through the denomination itself. Oftentimes, one of the ways I do continuing ed is through the United Church of Christ here in New England, and I help teach a seminar for the UCC. So that's the other thing. And then there's this third area that's kind of this weird mishmash of retreat centers and these innovative hubs, or and I think that's the area where I feel like there's going to be the most growth. In many ways, I think that, like you think specifically about something like the BTS Center, which used to be a seminary and is now an innovation hub and center, and a lot of what they do is lifelong learning now. And you see the changes in what they're doing, and the schools, I think, that are also the seminaries that are also responding well to the changes are the ones that are focusing on this lifelong learning piece, and especially how to do it online. So that's kind of the basic landscape of what it looks like. And we have a little bit of everybody, but I think where we all can do better, I think, is in the networking and developing a connection, a connective tissue between these various pieces. Where lifelong learning can be better connected to the greater whole of what's happening in theological education, and where seminaries, denominations, retreat centers, etc., are seeing themselves as part of a wider ecosystem that's all addressing lifelong learning in different ways. Because we need a lot of different approaches right now.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the things that I, serving on the board as a representative of the School of Global Citizenry, am super passionate about, because when we first emerged in early 2019, we had people actually upset because we felt like a competitor to them, when in reality, we were offering programming and a platform for others to teach that was intended to complement, not at all replace. We will never have a doctorate of ministry degree at the School of Global Citizenry. We have no desire for that. But I have one personally, and I that was valuable education. But partnering together is one of the things that we hope will teach people what our mission is about, and the BTS Center being one of the educators at the School of Global Citizenry. So I think for ourselves and for folks like us, being in a guild like the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Ministry, it is a great way to show that we're in it together, and that we want to learn and grow together, because we can't all be all things to everyone, because continuing education and lifelong learning is such a robust and dynamic need, if you will, that it really is. I think, Josh, you said it well. It's going to take all of us doing different things to really meet the needs of the leaders and the ministers out there on the streets, in the churches, trying to address the needs of their people. So I love that ALLLM represents that sort of diversity and is evolving into that. Even your story of how you ended up here, I think, is compelling in that respect. So Josh, to that end, what is ALLLM doing today to help equip leaders in lifelong learning? What sorts of activities, events, programming is ALLLM offering that folks can take advantage of?
Well, as you know, we've been doing quite a few workshops and webinars, and especially since 2020, since the pandemic, that's grown. There's been a greater desire, a greater need. Community has built, and we've added members as a result, which has been wonderful. Another thing that has been really great, because we've been attracting people from all over the world, but is harder because we're not in person, is the networking piece. So when you have conferences, you have those informal connections. Online, you don't have those in the same way that you do when you're in person. But but there are connections that can happen, right? And so I do think that continues to be a valuable part. And so one of the challenges, I think, for us as an organization is to figure out how to bring us together, because that's one of the things that ALLLM members have long said is one of the things that they value the most, are the relationships with other people who are in the work, who feel, frankly, alone sometimes in what they're doing, especially when they're maybe those who are in seminaries. They feel like they are the only ones in their institutions focusing on lifelong learning. And so they might feel a little isolated, sometimes maybe a little excluded from the academic hierarchies, And so how do you bring people together? How do you network? I think that's something that ALLLM does, and on kind of on an informal level. One of the ways that I think we can increase doing that is with formal ways of doing it. We're starting this whole a cohort program that we're all very excited about. We recently, Sarah Erickson, who I just mentioned, she is leading up she was able to receive a grant from the leadership education program at Duke Divinity School, and was able to secure this grant to do a strengthening ministry coaching cohort program. And so there's going to be 2 different cohorts that we're going to start over the course of the next year, starting in the summer or fall, I guess. And so we've got about a month left for people to apply to that program, but it will be a couple of sessions, about 5 sessions with a coach, people who are just starting off in lifelong learning for ministry, and those who are mid-career. And there will be meeting, there's set times for each of those groups, and there will be 5 meetings, and there's a whole process in which they're going to be going through together. So you're going to be going through kind of your own innovative process and developing your own goals and strategies, but then you're also developing that network and that community together, and allowing each other's problems and strategies to mutually influence each other, right? So there's a synergistic effect that will hopefully happen when you're doing not just one-on-one coaching, which is another way in which lifelong learning is innovating in ministry. But but when you're doing it as a group, there could be additional benefits to that, not the least of which being the relational elements. So I think that's one place that we're growing and developing. And so networking, and we do some research as well. I should really say Helen does research, right? And has really made some really important strides, I think, in that regard. And consulting, I think, is something that we are working on, as well as and developing, and I think there's a huge need for that as well. So ALLLM does a number of things, and some of it's in development, but also I really like this idea of us. And one of the key focus, I think, for me this first year has been, I'm really excited that Sarah is helping lead up this cohort program. And hopefully we can find other ways of bringing people together and network, which we've already begun through the webinars and through online community. But hopefully maybe at some point we'll get together in person again. I mean, as crazy as that might sound.
I know we've kind of defaulted to this because we know it'll work for fear that something will be canceled. But I think, Josh, what I love about the coaching cohort in particular is we embody what we're hoping folks will teach, this idea of working together, sharing best practices, sharing even the troubles and, and difficulties that we're having in the work that we're trying to do, so that we can learn from each other in the same ways that we're hoping that folks out in the world doing the work will do, that they won't try to go it alone, but instead will create a community for themselves. This idea of kind of coaching the coach, I really like that we're doing that. So there's about a month left. This is coming out mid-July 2022. There's about a month left. How do people, how do they get involved? How do they learn more?
Well, I think if you go to the ALLLM website at allm.org, ALLM.org, and if you like how it looks, you can thank Lindsay for that, because she helped revitalize the website, which was desperately needed. You can go there, and if you scroll to the bottom of the front page, there's links. There's a flyer there that you can download. There's an application. There's a QR code on the flyer. There's also the application to online. It's I can say it out loud if you need to, but the simplest way is just to go to the web page. But if you're looking just for the application, it's tinyurl.com/ALLM, ALLLM. So
excellent.
It's probably the easiest way is just to go to the front page.
Yeah, and so the website is a perfect place. You can get more information. You can find out what those meeting times are, and then you can also go ahead and click there and apply directly from the ALLLM website, which is a great way to get involved. Josh, before we go, what is one of the innovations that you're seeing online as far as lifelong learning that is inspiring you right now? You don't even have to say who it is if you don't want to, but what are they doing that's inspiring you right now?
Well, I think I've mentioned most of the stuff that I'm really focused on. But I think the key here is that there's no one size fits all, right? There's so many different ways in which it can be done. There's no one right way. There's no czar of lifelong learning that is overseeing everything, which is why it's so nice to have a network, right? So you don't, you're not necessarily, again, like you were describing earlier, you may touch on similar areas, but instead of seeing each other as competitors, to actually learn from each other, right? And to see that as a value added and each other as all part of that same landscape, I think is really valuable. But online learning and online networking provides that opportunity, right? And you can do that also. One of the great things about ALLLM being an international organization, which it's increasingly becoming so, we have people from Australia and Canada specifically that come in and join us. There has been some cross-pollination in learning what they do, which can be very different. And that's been very exciting. So that's all good. I think coaching and cohort groups and those kinds of things are really key. And those, again, can be done online. We're getting better at being virtually present with each other, and learning how to be connected with each other. There are things that are possible now that maybe weren't possible 3 years ago because we've been trained how to do this online thing a little bit better. The other thing is, I think, just creating spaces for more innovation. And that can be done online, but providing opportunities to innovate. And maybe also when we're doing this, you're actually teaching to innovate, right? It's not just creating the open space, but it's also you're teaching other people how to have a different frame of mind, starting from problems and working towards solutions and trying and not necessarily feeling boxed into what you've done in the past. And, doing that, creating that kind of space, whether it's using online jam boards or whatever, where you can all kind of work together on a problem, or if you want to, brainstorming together to kind of come up with solutions, conversations that, and breakout groups where you can begin to start kind of workshopping these ideas. There's a lot of opportunities in online learning to be able to do that across a lot of different barriers. And so I think that's only going to be to our benefit if we can find ways to continue to nurture that kind of approach, I think. That's not necessarily a formal program or something that's very defined, right? But it's also but I think especially when we're weathering a time of change, there has to be some space for those kinds of things. And then we tend to think of education, and this is more obvious for ministry than it might be for others, but I think it's just as applicable for other forms of education. We tend to think of education as about intellect and about ideas and about coming up, learning strategies and protocols and, those kinds of things. And we don't think of it as relational. We don't think of it as psychological, or may I say spiritual. And thinking about it in those terms, it's vitally important that we find ways of attending to our own enrichment and our own growth as human beings, as learners, and to be learners ourselves as we're teaching, right? And to nurture that own heart within us. That can't be so easily defined. It can't be put into a curriculum in the same way that, 5 strategies for how to grow your organization can. But it's just as vital, if not more so, right? So I think that those are the kinds of ways, and it's hard to do that online authentically. I think we're getting better at it, but that's, I think, critical.
Yeah, I like that approach. We're not going to replace online, so we're going to need to learn how to do it better. And I like that challenge, and also that reminder that here's where we are, and let's see what we can do with it. Because I don't think that online learning and online education is going anywhere anytime fast, but we are, like you said, learning how to do it better. Josh, thank you so much. So incredibly helpful and insightful. And thank you as well for your ongoing support of efforts like organizations like ALLLM to ensure that future leaders are well equipped for these changing times. Yeah, thank you so much. Well, folks, so that's our show for today. Thanks so much for your time and attention. And don't forget to look up the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry and its upcoming coaching cohort, made possible by funds given from the Leadership Education at Duke Divinity School. I'm Reverend Dr. Lindsay Andrioli Comstock, and this is the Online Educators Forum. See you next time.